it's been an interesting phase for an older facilitator like me to learn how to use the new technology. And so welcome aboard, and thanks for joining. Anna will be there to help me. So if it looks a bit clumsy, it'll be me that's the one. But I guess the idea for the forum came from a session we ran with the Geelong Chamber of Commerce recently, and the feedback was really positive. And I guess we thought, well, why not go into our networks and offer the same thing. So key things for me from an introduction point of view, first of all, I'm Ray McLean, one of the co-founders, and I see some familiar faces there on the screen, but one of the co-founders of Leading Teams, been in the business now. Well, I've been facilitating now for near to 30 years, so it's been a long journey, but a really enjoyable one. And for today's session, I guess one of the things that was pleasing about the setup was that quite a few people had given some hints about the sorts of things that they'd like to see covered off. And so to the best of my ability, what I've done is prepared the presentation, but Anna's got people on mute, but you can use the chat to just fire questions through to her, and I'll sort of, pause along the way. And so if you need more detail about what we've covered, that's probably the best way for us to try and manage that. And I guess the other point that I would make is that even in this sort of unusual forum, I think it still applies, in my view, around the idea that you'll get to drive whatever learning outcomes you want out of it. I think Albert Einstein said, real learning's what's left when you've forgotten what you were taught. So I certainly don't favour it being, just a pure lecture. So I'll pause along the way and ask Anna if there's questions, and try and manage that conversation as best we can. Pardon me. I guess the first part in starting, though, was that there was some fairly strong and central themes that came through. So some of the things around anxiety, uncertainty in this time, connection and relationships, accountability, for performance, conflict, managing those sorts of things, and also, I guess, the cultural piece or the purpose piece. And so for me, that's where I'd really want to start. So Anna, if we have a look at that, and I suppose the other point that I'd like to make is that I don't want to. My intention is to make the link between the unusual circumstances that we're facing now and address that, but also, I guess, to remind people that there are broader principles that apply, that, whether we're in COVID or not. And so I don't want to just necessarily make it specifically about that. It's been, I guess, a great reminder for me about the power of our model, but that it's not just exclusively around this period of time, but happy to sort of jump between the two. So the first thing, I guess, if we start where the COVID, really hit us, as a business, we were no different to anyone else. And I guess that, this morning I'm happy to share any of our experiences with you. I'll be as open and frank as I can be, and be guided again by your questions. But we were in a position where it was unclear, I suppose, about the impact that it was going to have on us. So when the lockdown began, we're naturally enough in our normal mode. We're exclusively face-to-face with people. And so as quickly as possible, what I found was the power of having invested in our model and having something to fall to, so that it wasn't an in-theory exercise. And I'd encourage you that was the first thing that really hit home, was to what extent do we really live our model through our business. And I was pleased to say that, that gave us certainly some something to fall back to, which was useful. And Anna, if we have that first slide, just the concern and influence one.
Yep, I'll share now.
I guess this was where we started, and this is work that certainly Stephen Covey and others have done a lot of work around. But as early as on that Sunday, the Sunday that we were leading into the lockdown, it became so important for us as a group of leaders in the business to meet quickly and start to really address, what are the concerns that we have, but more importantly, start to really reconcile what can we actually influence and control and get our head around that straight up. And so naturally, everyone had, some major concerns. It was really broad. But one of the things that happened was we sort of went back to, we've got 19 people on our team that are scattered around Australia. So we went firstly to let's make sure that we address the fundamentals, the really important things that individuals are concerned about. So how's their family affected? What's going to happen to them from a financial perspective? So we really encouraged every person to try and, stabilise or clarify their own position, because it didn't make sense that we would jump in as a business and start to sort of deal with strategy around how we're going to cope here if we hadn't got people who, it's almost a Maslow's hierarchy in a sense, people who haven't, got the really basics of their family and their life organised first. And when we did that, then it put us in a position to be able to start to address, okay, so now as a group of leaders, what do we need to start to consider? And that, that's where it became really important, the link between controlling and influence and, the relevance of our model to us. And so the first things that we had to do were, based on the relationships that existed within our team, is to get back to the team as quickly as we could with a position that was able to say to them, look, we've had a look at the numbers, we've had a look at what we would call the mechanics, and reassure people that we'll go through to the end of the financial year no matter what happens. So at that stage, we were concerned about our clients and what was going to happen and what was going to happen to them. But more importantly, it was just to be able to stabilise our group so that then we could actually, make more reasoned decisions. So all of you, I imagine, at some stage would have been in that position as teams, but also as individuals. And so that was terribly important. I guess if you've done the reading from Covey and others, the sense that at an individual level, being able to understand that the more that you can, take responsibility for yourself, and as a leader, it's most important, the more that you can take some responsibility, the more you tend to actually push out those areas of influence and control. And that it'll be from a strategy point of view, but it'll also be from a language point of view. So as soon as you have leaders in organisations who are using that, what we might say more reactive language, or there's nothing we can do, or we're really stuck, there's no doubt that followers then become, of course, troubled by that as well. So being able to just get a clear picture and then being able to take that to the group, we found to be really important. The other thing I would suggest there too is that it didn't matter. You weren't looking for a reassuring response. What I found with our team and what I've found with my other clients' teams is that what they were looking for was really an honest response from leaders. Even if it was bad news, being able to actually being able to manage that and being able to be frank with people was just so important in those early stages. Now, I guess having lived that experience, that's what drove me back into, the absolute relevance and the importance of having lived our model. And so, Anna, if I might just get you to throw that one up, and I know that we've got people who are familiar with us and some who, might be with us for the first time. But this is the basis of the work we've been doing. And I guess the first link is that idea between the high-performing team and the high-performing leaders. Now, what I found when the pressure, I guess, of the pandemic and that really came to bear, sometimes that high-performing language might not have been as relevant as perhaps just really how do we survive? How do we get through? So that idea of, still being a high-performing team but being under some pressure or being really uncertain had implications for both the team and the leaders. And when the first part for me, which was most important, and I couldn't recommend more strongly that people, I guess, check themselves in this space, is the importance of the common purpose. Why do we exist? Now, when we're exploring that question, and for those who've worked with us before, we may very well, there's a difference between it just being something we need to do to sort of put into our corporate document, as opposed to, is it something that we actually live and breathe? And so over the journey, sometimes I've posed the question that would be, if you didn't exist as a team, what is anyone any worse off? And if we can't have a really proactive response to that and then have it filtered through our team, then that's something that, whether it's COVID or not, is going to impact performance. And most importantly, under pressure, that I find that would be the first hurdle for us. And so, as a real example, I found myself, which is it's unlike my leadership style, but on the Monday morning after we'd sort of gone into the lockdown, I made a video and sent it out to our group. And one of the points that I wanted to make really strongly there was that our purpose is to help teams and individuals to improve or become high performing. And I guess the strongest point that I wanted to make to our group was that it didn't have in brackets beside it, unless things get tough, or unless there's a pandemic, or unless there's something else that happens, or unless the clients can't pay or whatever. There were no brackets attached to it. And so I thought that was really important for us to get to really quickly. And that meant that people could then go to clients, and the help might have been as simple as, how are you going? And is there anything that we can do? And it wasn't, I think it was most important that we got past the point of, again, whether the business was in good shape or not. If it was good enough prior to that, that we were working with that particular team and we were helping them then. If they got into trouble, it seemed to me logical that that was about the last point at which you'd want to leave them. And I guess for me at a personal level, an example was the Sydney Swans. And for those that are not familiar, the AFL system fell off the edge very quickly. And so the first people that were, I guess, told that they were no longer required were anyone in a sort of a consulting role, which included me. And one of the things that I guess I found myself doing, based on how seriously I sort of take our model anyway, was to get to them and say, look, at the end of the day, whether I'm getting paid or not doesn't really matter. I can sustain myself for a while, but can I still help? And we actually ran quite a lot of development work via Zoom over that period. And I think it helped me to understand that, the first question wasn't, I guess, about me. It was about what can we do? And I was reassured that you had a role to play still, and so that continues now, which has been pleasing. But I think that, again, the element of that common purpose is so important. From a leadership perspective, I think as leaders, we have to take responsibility for how that is spread through the organisation and what effort do we apply to making sure that every person in the organisation is as clear about purpose as what we are? And I see when I visit clients potentially, what I look for is the difference in language. And what I mean by that is that if you have people who might be in roles that say, and you ask them what's their role, and they might say, oh, well, I just do the books, or I just do this, or I only do that. I sort of read into that somewhat they're disconnected from the purpose. So as a leader, in that circumstance, I tend not to look at the individual and say, well, what's going on there? I'd say, what's happened with the disconnect between the leader and the individual there? Why isn't it that they've got, that clear? And I know I've used the example before and plenty of people have probably read it, but that terrific story about John F. Kennedy touring NASA, and he stops and talks to one of the cleaners and asks what they do, and he says, I help put people on the moon. It's a really important point. And not that long ago, I was observing one of our team working with a client, and the CEO of the organisation came up to me in a break and said, I just thought I'd let you know how you got the work, and made the point that in our headquarters, the person who preceded Anna in the role, Lisa, they said was so clear and so invested in the conversation that they were looking at potentially, say, 5 providers, but most of the other responses were, yeah, I'll take your details and I'll get someone to get back to you. Whereas having that person who was connected in like that certainly gave us an advantage. So I don't see it as a tried exercise. I don't see it as an in theory exercise, one that we need to do because Business 101 says we should. I see it deeply connected to performance. And if you get that piece right, then so many other things will flow from it. And if you ask any person in your organisation, and if we ask ourselves, that common purpose for us should translate to someone being able to articulate that really clearly for their individual position. The reason why my position exists, the reason why my function in the team is so important is this reason. I'm responsible for. You'll hear quite different language, and I think that's really important for leaders to look for. And as I said, it just seemed like the logical thing to do. I was so pleased that it's so ingrained in us that was where we went to first. How can we help people? How can we help teams? And I suppose the other part is that from a cultural perspective, we also have in place what we would call a trademark, and that is our culture and our behaviours proposition. Now, for some people, you might call that your value statement or code, creed, whatever. But again, ours talks about going the extra yard and has a set of behaviours which are associated to that. So for me, the marrying up of the two became almost our greatest support when we were facing potentially our most adverse time. We're here to help people and individuals improve, and we go the extra yard with them. And I just felt as though really early days we were able to have some tangible examples of that, where we were able to share among our team, and that in turn built some confidence with people. And that was the starting proposition there. So the dynamics piece being, I guess, the connector to the mechanics. And I hope, again, what people can see is that there's such a strong connection between the two. If we'd been just talking about our purpose and our trademark and how important culture is, but had not been open and frank with the team around the mechanics around the actual numbers and what are the implications for the business. So the two marry up, but on the other side of that, as a way of balancing, if we'd only focused on the bottom line and said, look, here's the projections, this could be, you know, a really, really tough period, and that's where we left the conversation, then that would have been problematic as well. And so I guess on the extreme, one of the people that I'd crossed paths with recently gave an example of, you know, what had been a really good business in the hospitality area. And when that hit, when the pandemic hit, everyone was just stood down, given a link to JobKeeper, and then 10 weeks later, the head chef just got a message to say we're back and going again. Now, he didn't go back. And I think that reminds us of the balance between the two. Building strong professional relationships is a pivotal piece of that. And so, Anna, if we could go to the urgency slide, this is where we might get a bit more... So this, I guess for me, and as we're touching on these points, we can now see the importance of relationship. And in times that are less urgent, that's when, if you notice the split there, the dynamics and culture piece, that's where you can focus more effort. And what I've been saying to some of the leaders I've worked with is that if you didn't do that prior, and you may be paying somewhat a price for it, then surely as you're coming back out, don't allow that to happen again. Go back and have a look at your culture, have a look at your purpose piece, and build strong relationships with the key people around you. And if you do that, when times become urgent, then you can call for people to focus a little more on the mechanics, on the task at hand. And what you've done has invested in them earlier so that when you've got a call for help, they're actually expecting to do it. They want to come with you. And that to me, that's a significant challenge in leadership. It's that willingness to trust you and to go with you. And if you haven't built that, it's very difficult to say to someone, right, times have got tough, we need a greater investment, or we need your help now, if you haven't done the work early. And so what I've said to, as I indicated earlier, what I've said to the leaders of the organisations that I've been working with now is that if you've found yourself somewhat exposed in that area, then don't allow that to be replicated. Start to look at how can we build those relationships. Assess first, how are they? The other point I would make about this particular model is that it gives us a reminder about the sliding scale or the sliding nature of leadership as well, that in certain times your style will be or can be more directed or more consultative. My natural style is to probably lean toward the consultative end, but in terms of when we were preparing, I guess, for the worst, I was able to go to the group and again be more directed, I guess, than what I would typically be, but have the group okay with that. It wasn't a shock. It wasn't like, oh God, what's happened to Ray? It was just, I'm going to be firmer now with what I need from you. And the first thing that I really said to our group was that irrespective of how long the isolation goes on, I couldn't accept that we couldn't continue to develop as facilitators. So I guess the directness was, I want all of us to be able to share a plan with one another about how we'll be better facilitators when we do come back out again. And I think that sort of sharpness of focus and the building of the relationship prior to that enabled us to be able to buy that time. I suppose the other part to this model which resonates with me around leadership is that some leaders who lean more toward being directed and may spend more of their time treating teams as though it's always urgent, in the end you wear people down. This is a sliding scale because it's about that investment that you're making in the relationship. Build the relationship, talk to people, look after the well-being of individuals in the team when it's not quite as urgent, and then when it's urgent, you can call on people. But if you haven't done the work, then it shouldn't be surprising that there could be a problem when you call people to arms and they're not quite ready to go. And as I said, the fact that you may or may not have does not take away from the fact that if you've noted that that's an area that you can improve, then make sure you do. And I think that's something that we've been working through with quite a few groups now. Anna, if we go back to the leading teams model, and perhaps have you got any questions there?
Let me have a look.
Because certainly that's what I'll do, is just pause and give you a chance to stop me if there's questions.
Is the urgency model saying that as the situation becomes more urgent, then our leadership must move from consultative to more directive?
I think that's the really important part to that, is that I find that the very best leaders are the ones who can actually slide on that scale. And that you're not locked into one particular style, and yes, it's situational. Mm-hmm. But you remember what I went back to at the start though, was that keeping your teams informed and making sure that you don't hide the situations from them is the start point there. So when we were able to go to the team and talk about the urgency of this situation, it meant that people locked in quickly and they could accept that more directed style. So yeah, the answer is that, that's how it should slide.
Yeah.
And again, it means that sometimes you wrestle with yourself a fraction as a leader. That's why knowing what are my attributes as a leader, what's my preferred style, so that you know when you're moving to another, as that was most, I noticed that we've got one or two people from leading teams here, but I would have thought they would have thought that is most unlike me on day one of this event, to go to the office, prepare a video that was quite direct about what we're going to do and what we need to do moving forward. That was not my style. But if you recognise and know yourself well, then you can drift to that and know that it might be a fraction uncomfortable, or you might feel like you're operating a little bit outside your own skin. But you do that for the sake of the team. Because in that case, had we stayed in that more consultative mode and wanted to chat to people, why don't we all get together and why don't we talk about this? In that moment, I think people could have interpreted that perhaps the leaders don't know what to do here. So as the leader, just that first part about, well, what are my attributes? I'd encourage you all to do this as an exercise. Put down what your really strong attributes as a leader are. When you're functioning at your best in that role, what are you doing? But then what might be and do you have a plan and a recognition for when you might have to go there? And I think that's the power of that model, Anna, is that it just reminds us. But as I said, I'd go back and say that if you operate in not one or the other is not right or wrong. So please don't interpret again that a more directed leader or a more consultative leader is the right or wrong. It is operating in the situation that requires that, and both have their flaws if you stay in that mode all the time. As I said, in the more directed mode, you'll probably wear people down. If they feel like every day's urgent, every day's like that, you wear people down. But just as much on the other side, if you are always in that consultative space, sometimes people can get a feeling of lacking direction, lacking, targets. Like you can almost have that. That's the fallout, I suppose, at the other end. So it's a really interesting balance. And as I said, you being aware of you, I couldn't recommend an exercise more strongly than being frank about that. And also getting advice from people, that you trust close to you, who can give you that feedback and let you know how they see you as a leader. So that's certainly how I would view that model. Are there any others there, Anna?
There's a few about trust seeming to be critical in the model.
Correct.
And maybe a bit more explanation about genuine conversations.
Yep. So the trust piece, for me, that I guess is that we're now moving down into the model a little further, but that idea of building those relationships with people, but also bringing them into the space of agreeing the behaviours that we would want to see from one another and expect from one another. That piece for me is terribly important. When we're building those relationships, I think the most important thing is that you can't shortcut it. There is a time that's required and an investment that's required to build those, and that's having people. We would call it, putting depth into the relationships. And we've got a slide, perhaps Anna, if we put the relationship pyramid one up, I can get to that piece. The idea that at a superficial level, you've got what we would call that first stage being the grunt stage. So if you imagine people being in that condition of walking past one another at work, and it's really just almost the nod of the head or just a vague acknowledgement. Then going to as we build depth, going to the next stage, which is the stuff or things that we talk about, and that might be that we're prepared to talk to one another about it was a nice drop of rain last night, or did you watch the footy, or did you do? And we've got those loose connections, but still at a very superficial level. As we go a little further on, we might actually see some more connections within the team. So someone, we recognise there's a third party or another person we both know. So, how's Bernie going over there? Or, what's Justin up to? And those sorts of things. And we're, again, still at that safer level. What we try and do in teams that we're working with is to break into that, I guess, that area that requires, in the building of a relationship, a safety where you can actually disclose more of self. Now, I know that the word vulnerability is used a lot nowadays. It's sort of come into our vocabulary more, and it's absolutely relevant. It's that capacity of can I share? Can I actually, is it safe to do that? And pushing into the space underneath it where, as we build those relationships, where we have a capacity to be able to have genuine conversations with one another, say how we feel, and ask questions. All of those sorts of things, and I mean ask real questions, and not feel as though that might be a stupid thing to say. And that's that flow that we look for when we're going into that space. And I guess when some of you have certainly been exposed to this, but when you start to ask questions and you get people becoming more familiar with being able to talk about, say, their proudest moments or a turning point in their life, or You know, an exercise we run is where people might bring 3 items in from home and share with the group what you know, the real insight into who they are. And I think that's where the investment comes. It's not not a trite exercise. It's one where it's quite targeted, and and you can get a gauge early days about how much people are prepared to give of self there. And then, as I said, working on the building of the trust. So what's the team's response in that circumstance, and building the environment where, again, we use the language of genuine conversations, which is about, and I think we worked for a long time coming to that word as we were building this model. And I often used to think that when we spoke about feedback, we often created language which created fear. So sometimes leaders might have slipped into the habit of having positive feedback or constructive criticism. You sort of think, well, I know which one I'd line up for first. That idea of being able to bring into your culture the idea that feedback is feedback. And if you look at some of the books that have been written on the topic, fierce conversations, difficult conversations, hard conversations, those confronting conversations. And I think if we allow that to be the language that then, I guess, perpetuates into our culture, you can't. I don't think you could be surprised that people might be somewhat reserved about going there. And that's what we certainly want to try and bring people along, so that, again, in the most difficult circumstances, they can ask questions, they can seek clarity, they can make observations, and that's the relationship piece is so important in the model. We go back to the other one, Anna, and if you've got any more questions there. That's the one.
I had a question about influencing other leaders within a team to perhaps maybe adjust their style.
Sure. If you're in a leadership team and we're talking about influencing one another, I think it still drives us back into this particular area. So I'm working with a leadership. It's actually in the medical field. It's a radiology group, and I'm working with the 6 owners of the business. And one of the things that they've wanted to be able to do is to talk more about that. So it's almost related directly to the work I'm doing with them right at the moment. And the first thing that we started to discover was that, again, their relationships in terms of the mechanics, if you like, their role as medical practitioners, they were quite strong and robust. You know, that was just expected. But when they were actually meeting as leaders of the business, that's where the shortfall was. And so most of the work we've been doing is actually getting that leadership group, again, to agree on that behavioural frame. Now, to do that, one of the exercises we had to do with them, which can be quite confronting, is to talk about what behaviour we've come to accept as business partners and leaders from one another that's unproductive. And that was really the first time that we started to expose some of those issues about how they handled difficult situations at that board level, if you like. And there were so many things around avoidance, around one particular member of the team who was quite dominant, another who'd almost removed themselves. And so until we started to really focus on them, their team, their behaviour, what they saw in front of them, it was going to be hard to actually see that change in behaviour, if you like. And so now we're at the point where they've had some really useful conversations about what they really value from one another that they bring to the team, because it's rare that you have a leadership team where someone brings nothing. So be prepared to actually share with one another what I really do like about what you bring to the team. But most importantly then, the conversation about the behaviour which perhaps you could consider changing for us, that you could actually modify, that would help you and help us. And that's the stage that we're getting to now, where say, for example, if the more dominant person now in a board meeting is starting to go back to that old practice, people have felt as though they've got permission to be able to actually have that conversation. So they can literally just put their hand up and say, hey, listen, can you just make sure that you've heard what, and it's what the behavioural agreement for me is so important that it's not misconstrued as just this document we have to have that hangs on the wall. It has to be seen as a pivotal piece of your business. And in that case, what has happened is that it's given people there are two key elements from my perspective. One is that it's made it safe enough that they can challenge one another. And the other one is that it's given them permission to be able to do it. One of them actually made quite a funny comment. He said, this is going to be interesting, Ray, to sort of do it with doctors because we're all individually always right. And it was sort of like after we had the laugh about that concept. But it showed really clearly that we weren't actually challenging, if you like, in that mechanical space. We weren't challenging their professional expertise. They were confident with one another there. But what was happening was it was in that cultural space, in the team space, that where you know, some of their issues and concerns were laying. And so to get them to start to think about themselves more broadly as really high-level subject matter experts, but also that they have a responsibility as a leader, and that those two need to be sort of acknowledged and fleshed out a little bit more. And Anna, I guess as part of the answer for that question, could you just flick up that trust model, please? And so for me, that experience that this group are going through highlights that in one area in particular, they have really high levels of trust. So it's that trust in your competence. Have you got the skills to do the job, and can you apply those skills under pressure? And in that team, they're quite confident in that regard. But on the other side of it, and this is where we see the split for trust, is on the character side, you know, are you good for your word, and would you put the team's needs in front of your own if you had to? And that often becomes the challenging piece. So when you think about leadership teams, and if you've been in one where they haven't been perhaps as functional as they could, well, any teams, but leadership teams, then you start to break that down a little more. And often some of the issues that we see affecting performance in a team is when the character element isn't taken into account. And so another example for me is a client in a really quite aggressive sales environment, and the idea of in terms of the competence, having that highly competent person, but the one who doesn't buy into the team part and the problems that are associated with that. And so I think just breaking that concept of trust down into those two areas has been another really good way to be able to open up a part of the conversation which needs to take place if you're going to influence one another in a leadership team. And remember that idea of influence is that when you've created a team where they do have clarity around behaviour, they have clarity around performance, and there's enough strength in the relationships, then it opens the field up for people, I guess, to have that sense of feeling empowered, and you can really accelerate performance when you can create a team that's in that space. The one thing I would mention here, though, that I think is worth reminding is that the concept of empowerment is something, obviously, at Leading Teams that we believe very strongly in. The more that you can have someone who feels as though they have been empowered in that sense, they've got permission, that they can make those observations, that they can ask questions, then surely that would lead to a greater sense of, or a greater level of performance. But the thing about, I guess, empowerment is that it's not for us as a leader to say that we have done for someone else. The really important part about empowerment is that has to be something that I feel. And that's why empowerment, when it's used, often people might not interpret that it's about a relationship. And as I said, the person who's best placed to tell you whether they are empowered or not is the person who we believe we're trying to empower, and continuing that conversation. I've always, particularly I had this conversation with an AFL coach and his player leadership group it was a couple of years ago. And the way that I really saw empowerment was that he wanted that to happen so that the leaders would take more responsibility in driving, in their case, their business, but it just so happened it was a sporting team. But I always think that empowerment's a bit like the open ground that exists between the leader and perhaps the team that he or she are trying to empower. And if you're going to develop people, at times as a leader, there'll be a degree of frustration, or there'll be a time at which you have to wait and see what happens. So what was happening in this group was that if there was an issue, say, around performance or something that needed to be dealt with in the group, if the leaders paused long enough, they still knew that the coach would step in. And so it's that pausing and trying to encourage that people can step up into that space. And I suppose I've always held a view that if you're serious about the development of people in your team, then I'd sooner them make an error going too far than not enough, if that makes sense. Let them make that mistake and then review it. Don't see it first, fix it, because then you impact on their capacity to learn and step in. Now, there's going to be guidelines around that as leaders, about the level of mistake and all those sorts of things. But as a word of advice, I just think that if you're really trying to develop your teams, then becoming comfortable with experiencing that uncomfortableness is important. And you'll find out then how, who responds, how do they respond. And if you've created the environment where you've got that agreement around behaviour and you've got those relationships in place, then you get into a cycle of constant review. And that's really, if we're to go back to the Leading Teams model, those genuine conversations that sit at the bottom, that's where I see reviews. So the genuine conversations can be anything. They could be, I think people can sometimes misconstrue that they've got to be somewhat more formal. They could be as simple as walking past one another. It could be a small group meeting to quickly assess a project. How do we go? 3 words to describe that. What could we do better next time? The idea that you're in a almost perpetual motion around this work, I think, is really important to understand. We talk about learn, commit, do, and review. And that cycle is the lifeblood of really high-performing leaders and teams. Learn, commit, do, and review. And the point that I've made with the teams I've worked with is that if you miss any of those steps, I'm not sure that you'll ever be able to lay claim to being high performing. The idea that you're able to review regularly, then take the learnings, then commit to doing, and then do, and then go back and review again. As I said, I'm just not sure if you miss parts of that cycle that you can be as effective as what might be possible anyway, individually or as a team. And so getting that, and again, being able to review in simple ways so that it's not seen as a, you know, and I guess at the most extreme form, a performance review, for example, that might be 2 times a year, and that it's a more formal event. And in fact, that's the word I would use, is that if reviews become somewhat an event, then I don't think they, again, can be as effective. If you're going to review a performance of a team or an individual, I think the challenge for a high-performing leader is to make sure that in that circumstance, there've been so many regular conversations going on that there are no surprises. And that would be a really quite a functional conversation that you're having. And that, again, stretches us back to the notion that genuine conversations are conversations. They are genuine, and genuine's genuine. Doesn't have to be categorized. And have I invested enough in the relationship so that is a conversation? And once you're starting to have those, then as I said, it tends to just feed off itself somewhat. And I think if I had to make one observation there about having had some experience in elite sport and what are the lessons that we've been able to take from there and bring back, or vice versa, because I think both corporate and sport can learn from one another. But in the sporting environment, an athlete, I don't think, would go a day without having experienced some sort of feedback. And in fact, if they did, I think they'd be puzzled as to why. And if you can build that into that psyche in your teams, that feedback is feedback. Try not to categorize it. I've got some positive feedback for you, or I've got some constructive criticism for you, or whatever it might be. And the other analogy I suppose I've used over the journey with feedback is that it should be seen as valuable. In a sense, it's like receiving a plate of food from someone. You should be thankful that they gave it to you, but you don't have to eat everything. That idea that it's for your consideration. And that, I think that helps to remind us of the relationship piece in feedback, that I'm giving you feedback because my intent is that I want you to get better and I want us to get better, but I also have to respect you enough to know that then you digest that and you reflect, and then from there some of those steps around improvement can take place. And that's, I think that also, Anna, that sort of takes us back to the previous question about in leadership teams, that ability to influence one another. I think that really strikes at that point. If you look at Johari's window is another model that's been around for a while. But what they say in that model is that there's really two opportunities for growth. One is self-reflection. In other words, getting to understand you very well and addressing some of what might be hidden behaviours, things you know only about you and you may be avoiding them. And on the other side of it is the feedback. So the blind spots where you mightn't know, but people who are trusted and work with you do. And if you share the two of those, that's, I think, where you start to get into a real growth mode. And I guess, again, it just depends on to what extent, I mentioned it earlier, but to what extent you do want to reflect on your role as a leader or your role as being an excellent team member. Both require us to do that reflection and think about the impact of our behaviour on others. But being able to look at you first and being able to reflect on you, what are my strengths, what are my areas, and then being able to take that apart somewhat is certainly an early part of the journey. Are there any others there, Anna?
If there is a lack of trust in a relationship, could you maybe discuss how people would go about, building that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. It'll always be on somewhat a sliding scale, but if we go to that relationship assessment sheet, perhaps, one of the things that I think is most important in the earlier stages of building trust, building a relationship, is to acknowledge where it's at to start with. And so on that pyramid that we spoke about before, I tend to use that as just a really, a very practical, loose guide. Think about the people that you're closest with in the team, or think about your team, your leadership team. And then ask yourself, at what level roughly are the relationships? Now, you don't have to, it doesn't have to go back to necessarily, the grunt stuff, that sort of thing. It could be, is it at a stage that would sustain those genuine conversations both ways? Is it somewhere near there? Is it only just good enough? Is it not quite good enough, or is it a long way off? Don't complicate that. But that's, to me, that's where you've got to start. If we don't have a team that can acknowledge that there's some differences in those relationships, then it's very hard to begin the process of building on trust and building respect in the team. And so assessment of that first, just again that. And if you're in the team, having people who can do that exercise, and I've done this with, would be most clients I've worked with, would be in the leadership teams in particular, but other teams, is to ask the question. And then get people to have a look at that and then share, if it's safe enough, where are we at? And that might tell you things like where there's a mismatch, or it might get some acknowledgement that two people actually know that their relationship's very solid, or it might tell you that two people know that there's work to be done. And once there's a commitment that we can improve the relationship, again, I try and steer away from having people refer to it as, in negative terms. As quickly as I can, even if it's a relationship which is far from strong enough, I would always try and use the language around, well, can it get better? Is it possible that you could build a stronger relationship? So that idea of possibility thinking is so important there. In the worst case scenario, I worked with a local government group some time ago, and the manager of the team, when I checked with her to sort of see, what's the general shape of the team, how's it, she said they were in reasonable shape. But then when I did this exercise coming up that I'm going to talk about, I found out that there were two staff members on a team of about 12 that hadn't spoken to one another for nearly 2 years. Now that, in my view, is not great shape. And that if you know those things are happening, and that was an extreme case, but if you know that there are some of those relationships that need work and you're the leader of the team, then that goes to you as well to try and help there. But again, an acknowledgement that was how strained things were. And one of the exercises that we do soon after is to get people into pairs and just allow them to think about how they want those relationships to be. And again, it doesn't matter the start point. If the start point's at a low level, well, that's where it starts, and you work from there. And some people might need a little bit of help with this if it's really coming from a low base. But if you can get a commitment from people that there's a need to improve that relationship for the sake of the team and for the sake of our performance, then that's all you need. It's a start point. Two leaders of an organisation that I had worked with some time ago, both in key senior roles but were peers, and their relationship was in poor shape. And it wasn't until we started to talk about what's the cost of that. And I think people don't apportion that. Like, they got into the hurly-burly of, you know, they were both coming in, they were both working hard on the mechanics of the business. The business wasn't in terrible shape. It was, you know, if you're looking at the bottom line, it was okay. But this idea that they knew that their relationship was extremely strained, but they hadn't really, they'd looked at it as a personal thing to that point. And just that question about what is the cost? And all of a sudden they could start to get that sense of, well, it's actually causing it's almost as though people have to pick which team they're on. And then there's a sense of defending your leader. And the flow out in the end was that there was a cost. That helped them to acknowledge that it's going to be worth us working on that. And the first part, as I said, is to talk about the type of professional relationship that you want with that person. And so in this case, if you had this tool, each person fills it out first. And it's really important to do that because the whole idea, what I've found really, really helpful with this tool is that it stops people from talking before they're ready. It makes them plan the conversation. So even though it might only be bullet points, it just causes you to pause. And it's particularly if you've got a relationship which is coming from a lower base, often if you just lurch into the conversation about how we can get better, they may be starting from quite defensive positions. So then you run the risk that there's more finger pointing and more blame and excuse than perhaps being productive. So the type of professional relationship I want with you, a reservation I currently have about the relationship, 3 things you might ask the person to consider doing, the type of professional relation, and the questions 4, 5, and there is a question 6 as well. They are the ones that force empathy. So if there's been a relationship where people have perhaps allowed the relationship to slip to a point where it's unproductive, very often that inability to really see it from the other person's perspective has probably started to happen. And so that idea of the type of professional relationship I think you want, the reservation I think you might have, and then question 6, the 2 or 3 things I think you'll ask me to do. And if you think now about potentially if you've been in a team where you may have had a relationship which wasn't as strong as it could have been, I always try and think, without some structure and without a commitment, often we just fall to the top 3. It's what I want from you. I need this from you. And so the idea of those questions is to structure that up and then allow people to work through. The interesting, again, part about it is that it's an action-based piece of work. what you've got out of the 3 things I'd ask you to consider doing and the 3 things I think you'd ask me to do is your action plan moving forward. And if you make that sort of investment, then again, that's how we start to build depth. It won't, the idea of building trust into a relationship is going to be somewhat a journey, not just a revelation. The other point about the exercise is that it doesn't have to be that relationships are damaged. It could be a really affirming exercise as to why we actually function so well in our relationship. So I wouldn't just use it as a tool. For example, if you're in a leadership team, I wouldn't just use it as a tool where you work only on the relationships that appear to need more work. It's a great chance for you as a leader to be able to place a premium on relationships, full stop. The other part that's worth mentioning too with this particular model, and I've used this quite a bit as well, is that if you change the language just slightly on this particular tool, you can have conversations with teams that where internally where they may not be functioning as well together as they could be. So one that I worked with in the finance area in Sydney was a team where the sales team and the compliance team had some real issues, and it was almost as though their KPIs in some ways conflicted with one another. And so being able to sit down and say, well, how do we want the relationship to look together? What's your biggest reservation as a team? And so we had the same conversation and had some really productive commitments that were made so that they could, again, move forward and build the relationship between the two teams. In that circumstance, of course, there was also a challenge that they hadn't been led as effectively as they could have been in terms of understanding purpose. So they didn't have that connecting of the purpose of our bigger business. They were actually, almost at loggerheads with one another because their purpose was just for their team. And so there was some lessons in there for the leaders as well. But again, another way of just structuring a conversation with the intent. Keep the intent in mind and keep it simple. The intent is that we want to get better. We want you to improve. Don't allow it to become bigger than what it is. That's challenging enough, but just make sure we keep our language like that. That every team, and I say this to every client I work with, that I come into a group and I hope really disciplined around the notion that it's not for me to decide how good this team could be. I don't worry too much about the shape they're in right there. I want to find out what they think about the shape of their team. So that's the early part of the exercise. But then how good they want to be is going to be partly up to me as the facilitator to help, but very much about creating an expectation that anything's possible. And that goes back to our language around leadership. Are we people who perpetuate that possibility thinking, that it is possible that we could be great? Because one thing I think is really clear is that if a leader uses limiting language, that will be powerful enough to limit a team. And I think you put up sorry, I'll ask any other questions that have lobbed that you might want to.
No, I think you've answered them all so far, Ray.
Okay. Can we just have a look? We haven't got long to go anyway. The team talk model.
Ooh.
Did you have that
Yeah.
up? Or I thought,
That one?
yeah, there we go. This is the one where I think leaders have that real sense of being able to influence. And we were talking before about the honest appraisal of where we're at. So when we work with teams, those questions about are there behaviours that we accept on the team that we shouldn't? How would we describe our team now? Being able to bring that forward and be conscious of that, no matter whether it's good, bad, or otherwise, and I wouldn't use that language, but no matter what state the team's in, trying to develop I guess a mentality that no matter where we're at, we can improve. We can certainly take on the challenge to be high performing. But understanding that what sits behind that is the team image part, how others see and reinforce their truth about us. How we build that team image is really important. And leaders play a role in that. Our language can start to shape that. And then that becomes a part of, again, how we might talk about our team. And if leaders allow negative language to exist when we're talking about our team and engage in those conversations, that's the first part of the cycle that we really have to break. So a really stark example for me when I first began work in this field 30 odd years ago was with a football team in South Australia. And when I asked them how they saw themselves and how the opposition would see them, some of the words were just so negative. And so it would have been silly to start anywhere else. How do we see ourselves as a team now? How do we want it to be? And give people the opportunity to be as bold as they like in terms of their aspiration. And then, are there behaviours that are getting in the way of us getting there? And what are the ones that we most desperately need to promote to be the best we can be? And that's your behavioural framework going back to the original model. And if we can start to capture behaviour that we want to see on the team in reviews and reinforcement, then that helps to grow our team image. And as we start to see that evidence, our team talk needs to be, again, moving with that. Don't accept negative or mediocre talk. Catch the behaviour that you want to see and keep growing that cycle. I think probably the way to remember, I guess, this model is that if you've ever been in a poorer performing team, have a think about how that one applies. If we have a negative view of ourselves, we talk potentially a bit negatively about that team, we tend to watch for the things that affirm our belief. So we've got to be strong enough as leaders and team members to be able to break that open and be conscious of what's going on in the team and the organisation. And then when you can put that aspirational point in there and have leaders who are driving that, again, it won't mean that you jump from perhaps a poorly performed team to a high performing team straight away, but you'll start that journey, capturing those behaviours that we wanted to see, rewarding people who are doing the things that we agreed we wanted to see, challenging at times the behaviour that we said we didn't want on the team anymore. And as you're going through that, I think you can see the pieces of the picture, I hope, from this morning that fit that together. Having real clarity of purpose, building real strength in those professional relationships, having clarity around the expectations in terms of behaviour, and without being able to have those genuine conversations, it almost opens itself up to limited action. And I think it's important to understand that the genuine conversations for me mean that a part of your mentality as a leader in striving to be high performing is that you might experience, and I think there was a question or two about, when there's conflict or tension on the team, that you can accept that conflict may happen. But in those really high performing teams, what happens is we've built those mechanisms to be able to work our way through. We accept that there could be conflict, but we commit to resolution. If we don't do that, I think the other side of it, when we're not able to have those genuine conversations, the other side of it is that we have to almost fall back to what we would call that sort of artificial harmony. It's okay. We all get on all right. And if we have that language and that expectation, then to me, that's where the leader has to really lock in and say, no, that's not high performing. And I think it was, I know it's in Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, where he said that good is in fact the enemy of great. I love it when leaders decide to take that challenge, because that's that last bit, when you are going from a really good team, really good business, whatever it might be, to really stretch yourself into that space, because you won't do it by yourself. That really does require you to engage others. And I suppose in sort of, before I check to see if there's any other questions, a line that we've often used at leading teams is that, those with the most invested will be the last to surrender. So I go back right to the start. As leaders, what have we done to get that level of engagement? And using real examples for that, I think, is so important about when we've seen that extra. How do we reward that? How do we let people know? If I could give you in closing, a really good example from our point of view, was extremely heartening as a leader, was that when this COVID hit and the isolation started, and there was going to be, it was clear that there was going to be some impact, and we weren't sure. Within a really short period of time, what had happened, Anna makes up a team, is part of a team of 3 in our headquarters. We call them the headquarters team. And they're our support team, but they know our business inside out. But the really interesting thing was that as we were discussing how we might move forward and things we've got to do for the business, they'd actually presented to us a model for if they had to go from 100% pay to 75% pay to 50% pay, and how much and how long that can be sustained to help us without asking. Now, we haven't had to do that, but the idea of having a team where the work that's been done to help them to understand our purpose and to know that they're connected into it. Because just as easily with our business, we could be we're the facilitators, we're the really important ones, and the rest can, but that's not the way we view the world. And it's those subtleties that you'll see as your reward for high performance, I think. Any other obvious questions there, Anna, or otherwise?
Not at the moment, but we might there might be some coming through after you've finished talking.
I think the most important point, folks, is that if you've got further questions, I know Anna's going to give out some details if you want to forward stuff on. I'm absolutely serious that I'd be happy to flick through any answers or have a chat to you if you wanted to. But that's, I think that's probably as good a place as any to wrap up.